Ladies and gents, what is up? Welcome back to the Get to Know podcast. So, episode 2, we're still going to just go through kind of like the fundamentals. And as we'd spoken about, like we do have plans to go into a lot more detail in particular topics, but it would be very like unjust for us to not go through this and just kind of highlight the basics, the importance, and maybe some like nuance with regards like how you set up your diet. But again, we're trying to keep this relatively informal and just kind of make sure you're taking the main boxes, and that you don't lose sight of the forest looking at the trees, which is a pretty cool analogy. So yeah, as I said, today we're going to go through nutrition. So initially, what does a nutritional setup look like when you get a client on board, Alex? What are the main things that we're looking for when we're trying to construct something for them?
So for me personally, it would be like, where are they currently at? What do they look like? Have they had any previous understanding about tracking? Do they currently track? What phase are we looking to move into? What is the overall objective? And what do they prefer to do? I think we've had a conversation previously with ourselves about utilizing diet plans over utilizing macros. I'm more macro based as a coach. I very much prefer that, and I like people to become autonomous in their own right using macros, rather than becoming reliant. I know you have a different opinion on that.
No, pretty similar.
Yeah, so it's I like that approach, because it's like I've had people before where we've run with, so for example, a diet plan, and then once that goes, what happens next? It's like that completely falls, like they've completely fall to shit in some respects. And I like the idea that people are staying in control and they have autonomy, and they know, okay, well, once we've dialed back or once we're pushing up, I know exactly what it is that I need to do in order to adjust my macros accordingly, rather than being 100% reliant on your coach, for example.
Yeah, 100%. So it comes down to kind of developing self-efficacy and understanding like, right, what does your body need at any given point in time. And yeah, like tracking is essentially just a tool for you to develop that understanding of your current food intake. The reason why I would typically kind of start people off with more of a meal plan and still give them the macros that they have, that like allowance or that adaptability, because that's what's going to serve them over long term. But initially, getting people on board, getting them to see results is, again, it depends on who they are, where their starting point is, what their current knowledge base is. But we need to make sure like they have, that they're able to do this accurately, because we need to remember like tracking and flexible dieting and all these things, it's a skill, and you don't just like pick it up from day one. So kind of like some graded exposure of like, right, here's your meal plan, stick with this for a while, we start seeing some progress, we start seeing some results, and then maybe you start to switch a few foods that are kind of isocaloric or have the same calorie or macronutrient value. And it's kind of like building up that repertoire, that bank of different foods and that understanding of your allowances over time, that allows you to be a little bit more flexible. But again, it does kind of come through that trial and error period, whereas a lot of the people we'll work with are typically very busy, and like they don't want to have to spend 20 to 40 minutes a day on MyFitnessPal of like, oh, if I change this, how does that affect my daily total and so on. So that's where kind of like the dichotomy comes in of, right, your meal plan is going to give you structure, which is probably what most people need straight out the gate when they go from the gen pop kind of area into like, right, we want to start making some physique based progressions. Most of the time it is that structure and routine that they need to nail down. So it's kind of giving them that and then showing them how to potentially manipulate things over time.
Sure. I think it's the structure as well, to some degree, which you have to think about, what are they going to be most adherent to? Ultimately, it wouldn't be, as I say, it wouldn't be my number one choice to give them a meal plan. But if that means that they will get more structure and they will be adherent to it, then I most definitely will. Like, there's some clients that I've had in the past, some present, where macros just simply do not work. And that becomes apparent very quickly if you're in a diet phase and somebody's not losing weight. And it's like, okay, Do you do your steps? Yeah, I do my steps. Do you do your workout? Yeah, I work out. Do you do your cardio? Yeah, I do my cardio. Okay, well, your nutrition. Oh, nutrition's great. And it's okay. But is it though? So it's like, okay, I'm just going to switch this around. I'm going to give you a diet plan based on the macros I've got, and let's see where it is that we go. And then all of a sudden, there's a huge drop off, and it's just like, okay, that's where the problem was.
That's the thing, and it's not that like it's always being consciously manipulated or skipped out on, or someone's like taking the piss with it. A lot of this does happen on a subconscious level. As I said, when someone is new to this, they might be accidentally tracking cooked weight versus thinking they're tracking uncooked weight, you know what I mean? So or vice versa. So like these things, it's not as if there's like any malicious intent and they're trying to kind of, give an inch, take a mile. What's more than likely to happen there is just kind of a lack of experience. And like when you say, oh yeah, my food's good, my food's accurate, by what kind of metric? You know what I mean? If we don't have a quantitative metric, we're forced to use a qualitative or subjective metric of like, oh yeah, it's good. And like the analogy that often comes to mind, and I say the same thing with sleep, is like, have you seen is Daddy's Daycare?
Yeah.
Where like the kid goes in to take a piss, he comes out and he's like, oh, I missed. And then Eddie Murphy goes in, he's like, what do you mean you missed? He's like, I missed. So he looks up and there's fucking piss everywhere. It's on the ceiling, on the walls. But by that kid's metric, that was miss. You know what I mean? That was his subjective metric of missing. Whereas for Eddie or for a grown-up, that's a fucking disaster. That's miles. You know what I mean? So it's kind of like same thing with sleep, where someone's like, oh yeah, my sleep's fine. What by what metric? You know what I mean? So we want to think of these things like, if you haven't had really good sleep, or if you haven't had really high level of accuracy and consistency with your food, then what are you scaling your feedback off? If that makes sense. I know it's kind of an abstract way to think about things, but again, numbers don't lie. You know what I mean? So, but yeah, that's yeah. Go ahead.
I think that it just comes down to is like the ability to track and the ability of being aware and the want to track. And I think wanting to track and wanting to actually know what's in going into your body as an input is part and parcel of the battle, especially when it comes to some kind of clients. Some clients, like the ease of it is like, oh, just a little bit of this, and it's like, well, what's a little bit? Like a little bit of olive oil, and they're putting like 50 ml on. It's like that's quite a lot of calories right there. It's like, oh yeah, but it's good for you. Like, okay, questionable, but okay. You know what I mean? So it's all of that, like anything that goes into your mouth, you need to track to some degree, and then the sooner you can get on board with that thought process, the easier it becomes. Like I personally eat exactly the same foods every single day. That's out of preference, unless I have an off-plan meal, and then my off-plan meal doesn't get tracked, and I don't really even think about it. But my goals right now are to put on weight. That's fine. If I'm in a diet phase, I'm definitely not allowed an off-plan meal, so it's kind of like I have to have that discipline, and it does come down to discipline ultimately at the end of the day, about how much you want your ultimate goal.
Yeah. And I think that's an important point that you mentioned in terms of like your actual want to track, and you're wanting to track to develop your understanding so that you can then make these adjustments and then say, okay, now I know because I've tracked this food that this totals around this many calories, these macros, and how does that affect the rest of my day? Whereas I think a lot of people, it's kind of like, oh, I have to track because I was told to track. And like, no, you're doing so, and any adjustments that you make, you're trying to work within this target. And something that's kind of popped up recently, and like, this is something I would have considered like common practice or just like common knowledge, is like to pre-plan your food, not like days and all in advance, but like maybe when you're getting used to it and you don't have that skill level or that competence to make adjustments on the fly throughout the day, to put your food in ahead of the day so that kind of like, right, I can make these adjustments, and if these totals don't add up, what foods should I change? Whereas I find like some people, they track throughout the day, they finish their last meal, they put that in, like, oh, I missed. And it's like, oh shit, I went over by 50 carb, I went under by fucking 50 protein, whatever it is. And it's like, no, like you should probably do that early in the day so that you know what your last meal is. You know what I mean? It's kind of like your financial budget. This is what you have to spend for the day. Map that out accordingly. Same thing with like doing your monthly budget.
Yeah.
And
But then that just comes down to like overall structure and the ability to miss. It's like when a client says to me, it's like, oh, I'm like a 50 carb under and like 50 protein over. And I'm like, that's a lot. And it's like, from my personal perspective, it's like, what is the remit that we can miss by? I'd love to see a 0. Like that would be, in an idyllic world, that would be fantastic. But I usually say 5 to 10 maximum either way. There's an ability to have flexibility in that. It doesn't have to be complete rigidity, but in order to have some kind of control over yourself and actually create that pattern of behavior, then having some element of scale, that's fine.
Yeah. And obviously there's going to be a larger kind of standard deviation or a larger kind of dartboard to throw at in terms of like your accuracy when you start off, and then it's refinement over time and getting that a little bit more accurate. So you might say, right, in the first few weeks, first few months of coaching, when we're going through this experimental period of you getting better at tracking, we're going to aim for around over or under 10 grams of carbs or protein, and maybe within 5 grams over or under on fats. You know what I mean? So that could be a ballpark figure that you work with. Over the next few weeks and months, like, right, we're going to narrow that scope. We're going to get a little bit more accurate. We're now looking at 5 grams over under for protein and carb, maybe 2 to 3 for fats. You know what I mean? So we're narrowing that scope and developing our accuracy. And I think that's probably the kind of the best way to go.
And I think ultimately the rationale for people who don't know, the rationale for lowering the fats and getting that scope of fats closer is because fats cost more. But yeah, they are worth more essentially. So it's 9 grams per fat. No,
9
per
calories.
1 gram of fat is
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was going to say, do you want to do a quick little run through of macros? Because I know we've talked about it here. So yeah, like your calorie budget are made. This is just going to be a very, very brief synopsis, and hopefully a lot of people will already know this, but like your calories are going to be made up of proteins, carbs, and fats. Proteins and carbs are 4 grams of 4 calories per gram each. So 4 calories per gram protein, 4 calories per gram of carb, and then fats are 9 calories per gram. So there's more calories per gram of fat, more calorie density. Which is, as Alex said, is why we want to kind of keep that a little bit more narrow, a little bit more accurate. Basic roles of each, again, we're not going to go into excessive detail. Protein is pretty much supporting recovery, repair, enzymatic processes, a load of other things like skin and health as well. It's not just muscle tissue. It's really the building blocks of your body itself. A lot of the structural components are based off amino acids, which is what makes up a protein. Carbohydrate is going to be your main fuel substrate, and then fats can also be used as fuels, but they're also precursors for like hormone synthesis and so on as well. So the way we typically kind of aim to set that up is around, say, between 1.8 to 2.2 grams of protein per kilo body weight. Is a pretty fair point to start. Maybe 30% of your calories from fats, and then maybe the remainder from carbohydrates. Something along those lines. It's going to be scope either way, and a lot of what underpins your success with nutrition is going to be your adherence and what you can stick to over time. So that's probably something that we will get into afterward. But for now, you wanted to talk about some nutrient time and stuff. So
that's a recovery. Yeah. So in terms of like a recovery aspect, I think a lot of people always just want to go, I just want to push my calories right down. And ultimately the element there that you're missing is that once you're pushing your calories down, if you're pushing, for example, protein down, your ability to create protein synthesis, etc., and actually build tissue is completely down-regulated. Like it's suboptimal. Even in the maintenance phase, for example, like you're suboptimal in your ability to build tissue. And you're most optimal in your situation where we're in a calorific surplus. And in terms of like a recovery perspective, we want to be making sure that we're getting enough substrate and enough food into our bodies to be able to build tissue, because ultimately we're here for hypertrophy at the end of the day, right? We're not here to get skinny. So we don't want that. So we want to be able to provide ourselves with enough food to be able to fuel ourselves in terms of energy, so carbohydrates and fats, and then build enough tissue, lean tissue mass from protein, for example.
Yeah, perfect. Some kind of nuance toward that we'd probably say is like base most of your carbohydrates, not most, but just have a bias of them around the training window, and does seem to show pretty continuous positive effect in terms of like performance and recovery as well, just due to upregulation of GLUT4 translocation, blah blah blah, a load of science shit. Protein kind of wants spaced out relatively even throughout the day. And what else? So yeah, another consideration to have is like as you're moving protein up, like protein's going to be very satiating, which basically means it's going to provide a good bit of fullness. It's going to stave off hunger a good bit. So that's why typically you'll see people move that up a little bit more, maybe towards the tail end of a diet phase. But then also just the fact that protein is also a little bit more thermically demanding. So it has 4 calories per gram, but your body it wastes energy trying to take energy from protein. So it's basically not going to be as efficient as a fuel source, which is good if you're looking at it from a fat loss perspective. So that's why we typically or potentially move things upward from protein intake as the diet prolongs. And then on the other side of the same coin, we have potentially pulling protein down slightly as we get to peak kind of calorie intake. So to facilitate increased carbohydrate consumption, we might pull down slightly on protein. Now, it doesn't have to be anything significant, because you're going to have enough fuel there that like your protein demands kind of drop off. You know what I mean? Because you're going to have so much carbohydrate that you don't need to get any energy from protein, because it's all going to be there through the carbohydrate intake. So they're just a few considerations. And then obviously pulling back 50 grams of protein, like what's easier to eat? Is like 250 grams of chicken or a bagel? You know what I mean? It's like the satiety and the digestive component is huge there, and that can be a massive factor in terms of someone's ability to get the calories in.
Yeah, and it's the element of the, what was I going to say here, the protein's overall effect on you, especially when you're pushing down calories. You're going to have to lose protein as you push down. So even though we want to, in an idyllic sense, keep protein high, we're going to have to drive that down to some degree in order to keep carbohydrates and fats high, which is going to benefit innate performance. Because if we're not performing well in the gym, we're not pushing numbers, we're not still hitting or at least maintaining our logbook, you're going to lose irrespective of having a high protein level. Does that make sense? So irrespective of having to put down calories and irrespective of protein being protective in some respects of tissue, it doesn't make a difference. You're going to have to drive that down at some point.
Yeah. So that's kind of like the other side of what I had said, and that's probably something I overlooked, is like protein still contains calories, and if you're just on protein and you don't have the carbohydrates, you don't have the fuel substrate to train or maintain tissue, then no amount of protein is going to keep that there. You know what I mean? So again, it's kind of context dependent for the individual in front of you. Something we brought up earlier, I was just briefly mentioned there, was free meals. So how does that look for you? You mentioned about in your off season trying to gain weight now. What kind of setup do you find works best for yourself and for clients, from free meals, cheat meals, whatever?
So it's person specific and dependent. I think a lot of nutrition is person specific and dependent. Like what works for me wouldn't essentially work for somebody else. For cheat meals, it's like, be smart. A cheat meal is not going and eating a buffet and a banquet, or you can eat Chinese like every single week and filling your plate and having 5 plates. That isn't a cheat meal in my eyes, you know. And I don't, you know, having cheat meals, so to speak, is like that terminology for me doesn't really sit well. It's more like an off-plan meal, something that's not tracked. So it's a meal, and I think by having and calling it a meal or an off-plan meal, it down regulates the size. So it's like a cheat meal, it's like, I'm going to go fucking wild. And it's that psychology that's along the words. It's like an off-plan meal. It's like, okay, well, you can go for a Nando's, high in protein. It's, you know, there's still elements there, which is healthy. You don't have to go balls deep ultimately at the end of the day. There are times where I do, you know, your man will sit here and smash off 2 pizzas and not think twice about it. But that is, you know, that's me, and that's what my decision is at the time, depending on how it is that I'm feeling. What's my intake been for the rest of the day? Have I trained a particular difficult body part on the day? For example, legs. Do I need more carbohydrate? Do I need more fat? Etc. 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 Where's my protein requirement met, and have I met it already previously? So depending on the type of food that I eat and intake will dictate on where it is that I go and get food.
Yeah, and the psychological component of like the nomenclature and the terminology we give to these is very important, and I'm glad that you mentioned that. Is like, I don't really like the term cheat meal for points kind of like as you mentioned there, but like cheat indicates that there's an element of guilt, and that it's something that's off track, or that you should hide, or you should be, you know what I mean, some form of remorse around. Whereas like, if your coach is telling you to have a meal each week that you don't track, what are you cheating on? You know what I mean? Like, you're literally following the instruction. That is not cheating. So the main points there that like I always give with clients, and obviously like with myself in an off season, is like keeping shit as social as possible, and understanding that's probably the thing that you're missing, and that's the thing that you crave. We're very social creatures, especially kind of coming off the back end of a prep, or maybe just prior to a prep. Like, the food will pretty much always be there, and you should be going for the social component and the social aspect. You know what I mean? And like, even tonight, like, my parents are coming over, and I'm going to go out for dinner with them, and like, I'm on prep. I'm not going to eat food with them, but like, I'm there for the social component, and like, that's not something I would have been able to do a couple of years ago in my last prep. You know what I mean? Because your psychology is always saying, "Oh, it's about the food. We're going out for a meal, blah blah blah." But like, if you actually just genuinely enjoy spending time with the people there, and like value that as the main thing that you're going for, it reduces so much stress.
Yeah, I remember when I was in prep, I was like in the middle of shows, so it was like a month period between PCA to 2 bros, and I went out for breakfast one morning, and I had a little pair of drug dealer scales in my pocket. I'm there with the toast and the bacon, weighing it all out on the table, and the people were just like, "What the fuck is he doing? Look like a peeled man." Like, I think I was still orange from my previous show. I wasn't mad about it, and it's just like, okay, well, if you're gonna go and do that, like, ultimately you're in control of what it is you put in your mouth, and you're in control of the consequences of that. You know, your coach gives you what it is that he needs you to go and do. If you ultimately don't want to go and do that, that's fine. But if you are going to make a decision of like, okay, I'm going to go out for food, let's at least be smart about it, you know. Some people wouldn't go away and pull out a pocket scales, you know. I'm not mad about it. I know I'm making a decision here that I shouldn't necessarily be doing, but it is like, I'll make the best of a bad situation. And it is that mindset of where it is that you want to go, and that is very much a big extreme. Some people just wouldn't eat; like, they'd eat beforehand, you know. So it really depends, and I think the transition as well, between the mindset of what it is that you're doing in prep to, from, for example, dieting down in order to diet then back up, for example, for an off season. The mindset and the transition is when you go from that incredibly low body weight and you're then dieting back up to try and put weight on, your mindset definitely changes in terms of concern, you know what I mean? So yeah, just the effects and overall discomfort, and the overall look of how it is that you are physically looking different.
Yeah, so I think a lot of the eating disorders, and I'm going to use that term very loosely because obviously neither of us are qualified to talk about this in depth, and if this is something that you genuinely struggle with, then obviously like seek help from qualified physician or therapist. But a lot of these like poor relationships that people have with food that get brought out in a diet phase, that get brought out in prep, typically start to manifest in their off season. You know what I mean? So I think, well, like usually when people are like either excessively rigid, and then they usually couple that with like the binge eating and the cheat meals. Then when they take away that kind of relief or that stress, that not the stressor, they take away that relief or that outlet of binge eating, and then they try to go through a prep and just kind of like discipline themselves through it. Then these things kind of like just it's a snowball effect, and then by the time you're pulling on a dog's leash for months on prep, getting that person agitated. Show is over, you let go of the leash, they go to the buffet, they go fucking 2 weeks all inclusive holiday, they come back, their ankles are like water balloons. It's a shit show, you know what I mean? So what you kind of want to do is make sure that you develop and maintain a good relationship with food in your off season by keeping those kind of like social meals there. And if it is something that you are capable with, I definitely encourage people to actually go out for food and like just get a coffee or just get a water. You know what I mean? Like just being able to be there and understand that like the food will always be there. And that's something that I found is like, I was actually only reflecting on the other day why I found this prep pretty easy. Like, despite the fact that like there's so many good food places here in Manchester, like it's fucking unreal. Like I'll be walking down, finished off my steps, and going past like fucking Rudy's and loads of really, really nice places, and you just get that kick in the face.
No.
Yeah, but like understanding that it's always going to be there. You know what I mean? And that exposure to it, and like it's reassuring that like it's always going to be there. And that's what staved off a lot of my cravings. Because I'm not like, it'd be different if, let's say, I was on holiday on prep and then you're going down the street and then you see all these places, you're like, oh, it's now or never. I'm going home tomorrow. You know what I mean? But like now that you're here, you're in this environment, you're going past these places every day, you're like, yeah, like it's nothing. I look forward to it, but it can wait.
Yeah. So it's almost like, yeah, I know I can have it at the end of my off season, or at the end of my show. But it's just almost being like aware of it like beforehand, because it's like the element of hoarding food, which is something. Look, I fell foul of this in my first season. Like I hoarded a lot of food after competitions, cookies, sweets. Yeah, everything. I ate everything, and like ultimately, like I didn't suffer to the degree that I know some people suffered, and it can go one of two ways. And I'm incredibly lucky that I was able to stave it off. But the more shows I ended up doing, the less post-show treats I ended up having. But ultimately, I just became less and less bothered by it. Like ultimately, the end of your first show, you're just like, fuck this, I'm hammering that, I'm taking some of that, I'm taking a little bit of this and a little bit of this. And then I just remember by the time I got home from PCA in Birmingham, like my stomach was so distended, I had to come in here and have and be sick, like physically like sick, because I'd chosen to eat so much, drink so much. I sat in my car and ate a Nando's and did everything else, and I proceeded to eat like 3 cookie dealers and then some donuts, and it's all of those things. It's just like, okay, well, I realized when I got home, I was like, you've gone too far here, like, you know.
I think it's that scarcity mindset of like, oh, it's here, it might not always be here, but because you've been through that, and then you learn from it and you apply it in the next situation, it's like, okay, it's actually still going to be here. Same thing as what I was saying about like the actual restaurants. And that's something I think people should do like in their off season, not just make a list for after the show, but like maybe make a list in your off season. And when it comes around, like you have a plan, like for right, Saturday night, we go out for dinner. I have a list of places that we're going to go. And over the course of the next 8 to 10 weeks, we're going to go through these places. Obviously, there's some level of adaptability. Like you don't have to plan all these things. You can be sporadic. Like go out for the day on Saturday, and if you see a nice restaurant, like go there on your way home. But I think again, just keeping it like very, very social. But also, as you mentioned there about the hoarding thing, we talked about this a couple of weeks ago. I've done the exact same. But as I said, it gets to that point of accumulation where the scarcity isn't there. So it makes it less rewarding. So for me, what I done was those big fucking Milka bars. I collected them. It was literally a collection because I wanted the variety. I wanted to see all the different flavors like laid out beside each other. And that's thing. And like by the end of it, I had so many there that it didn't look appealing to me. And like knowing that there was so much, and like the fact that they were there for so long was like, it kind of put me off it. And what I done was fucking put it up on my Snapchat back in the day. I was like, does anyone want some free chocolate? Me sounding like an absolute pedophile. and I ended up just giving them away. You know what I mean? Because like you're there, you see them, and you're like, right, they hold less value now because they're so accessible. And to kind of get that mindset of like the food is always going to be accessible, it makes it a lot easier.
Yeah. It's it's an interesting one. Going back to like recovery though, from a nutritional perspective. Recovery, as I touched on previously, is the number one factor that is going to create success, in my opinion. Like genuinely, and obviously with that, there's branches of what's going to help you build enough tissue. So you've got sleep, you've got nutrition, you've got body fat percentage, and everything else that branches off of that. And when, for example, when I bring on a new client, when I'm looking at them and I'm looking at their body fat percentage, it's like that would dictate to me where it is that I'm going to take you as an individual. If I'm putting you into a surplus or a deficit, regardless of what it is your goal. So if somebody comes to me and says, I want to put on muscle, but you're clearly overweight, it's like, it's not physically possible for me to transfer you into an off season because that's completely suboptimal. Does that make sense? So yeah, from that situation, I would have that conversation with them to be like, okay, this is what my long-term plan is. This is what the short-term game plan is, and then from here we will just phase it and then push you out from there. But yeah, in order to maximize that, recovery does have to be on point, and that obviously comes from sleep and just overall rest and making sure nutrition is on point too.
Yeah. What else do we have to go through? I think we've covered so much of it, you know what I mean? And look, I know a lot of what we say is kind of like pretty abstract and arbitrary because there's no like specific guidelines of, oh, you should do this, you should do that. But like we've highlighted time and time again, it's like, find what works for you. Like for some people, from a practical perspective, what I find is most beneficial is like, especially those working like office hours or desk jobs or just a 9 to 5, a normal person job from our perspective, is like, right, maybe you just stick with that meal plan like Monday to Friday. Maybe Saturday, Sunday you have some free reign, or you could do something different where like, okay, you do your normal meals early on the day, and then like your final meal you have around this many calories to work with. You know what I mean? So it really just does come down to kind of that trial and error. And I definitely think avoidance of free meals and off-plan meals, again, I'm going to refrain from using the term cheat meals, but trying to be too strict and too rigid is what usually exacerbates those eating pathologies and makes people like very food focused. And just accepting and understanding like the lack of scarcity and the high accessibility of these foods should make it more comforting. Although more tempting, it should make it more comforting to know that like you can get these. You know what I mean? It's like context dependent. Where are you within your stage of your physique progression, within your journey? Are you on prep? Are you in a improvement phase? And yeah, just keeping shit really, really social. Because yeah, when the food is always there, like it's the people you probably want to spend time with, especially on prep. It's like you're probably not craving the food, you're craving going out and doing something with your partner, with your family, with your friends. So why not try and replicate that? It doesn't all have to be food focused. Instead of just heading out for pints with the lads, like just say, look, if you want to head out, you can still go down to the pub with them. If they want to play pool or whatever, have a few pints, you just sip on a Coke Zero. Like you're still getting some form of social engagement. If you're constantly just refraining and being a social recluse, it's going to exacerbate those thoughts. And all of a sudden you're at home feeling guilty about not having that interaction with people. This kind of like biographical suspension, which is similar to what people undergo with injuries, where like they refrain from social events, then they feel guilty about refraining from social events, and then that makes shit worse in their head. So yeah, I think they're the kind of main points to kind of discuss and to work with your coach. And a lot of this just comes down to like open communication. And once your coach knows what works best for you, it's like communicate that. Like you have that plan set in place, and then like you're not going to get misguided or confused directions from your coach, where he's not going to be saying, why didn't you track this day? Why didn't you track that day? I'm like, find out what works, communicate that. Once you get it all clear, run with it. If it's not broke, don't fix it.
Yeah, I think also is like, I mean, I personally had it in the past where clients have a great track of tracking, and then from that tracking they basically just stop, and then everything just falls apart, and I'm like, okay, so why did you stop? Oh, you know, and then all the excuses come through, and it's just like, okay, well, you still have to contain some element of rigidity and structure there, even if it's just a rinse and repeat, and like put it through your diary, copy and paste it, literally put it through exactly the same. It doesn't necessarily need to be there in terms of like exact specifics if you've decided that you don't want to be tracking to the gram. And sometimes you do have to track to the gram. If you're in prep, you better be cracking to the gram, you know, like yeah, exactly. There's little pinches of rice coming out, which is breaking your soul. You're like, shit. You know, but you do have to have an element of rigidity and discipline to it. So don't be surprised when you're not getting the results, because ultimately, you know, there's a saying of, you know, your physique's made in the kitchen. It's true, but also it's true, but it's also not. It's like your physique is made in the kitchen to a degree, but there's so much other stuff involved with it. But I think having a understanding of what it is that you're putting into your body, because ultimately a calorie is a calorie. You know, there's a way of optimizing it for sure, but the vast majority of people don't need an optimized plan. It's just a case of what's going to work for you, because optimizing something, it may be, number one, vastly expensive. Number two, they're just like, I don't understand why I need all these like intricate pieces, and you know, etc. So it's it's just like, as you say, what works for you, and that's the vaguest answer in the world, realistically, isn't it? But it is unfortunately the truth, and then that's client dependent, and that's where working with a coach for a long period of time, that coach can learn everything about you, but that requires you as a client, for example, to talk to your coach and dictate that to them. And I think that, you know, lots of people don't want to tell you about what they've been eating. It's personal. You know, food is a personal thing, and it's a cultural thing. It's it's something that makes you happy. It's something that makes you eat when you're sad. There's a lot of emotion around it, and that's a part of the drivers for individuals when they're, for example, on plan or off plan.
Yeah, and I think it's about understanding the kind of like dimmer switch approach, and I think we talked about this in the last episode in psychology, is like finding where you are. And it's not that you have to be tracking every single day to the gram, or you don't track and you don't know what you eat, but like maybe finding that middle ground and knowing like, right, I'm not going to track on these particular days, but what I am going to do is eat very similarly. You know what I mean? So then you know, right, I'm still going to be within this ballpark. Maybe what I'm going to do is stick with this meal plan, but I'm going to change my fruit and veg source each day. And then maybe I'm going to change my protein sources. Again, like for like, you have your lean meats, you're going to swap chicken breasts out for turkey mince, you're going to do steak instead of salmon, whatever it is, something that's a similar swap, but doesn't actually require you to track, because it's essentially going to be very, very identical to the food that you had replaced it with. But again, it comes down from the weeks and months prior to that of tracking. Right now, I know what 250 grams of potatoes looks like. I know that that's around 50 something gram of carb. What would be another equivalent? I could put in a bagel, I could put 60 grams cream of rice, whatever it is, you know what I mean? So getting that exposure, tracking your food, but then also reflecting on like, right, what does that food provide me? What are my other options or alternatives in case I don't want that food?
Yeah, I think ultimately there is that flexibility. Like even for myself, I won't do that. Like I won't give myself flexibility. And I wouldn't say I've got a food focus. It's just like I like to be precise. Especially like when, you know, when my goal is X, I want to know I'm to the point. Like I want to know I'm to the point, even though I eat the same things every single day.
Yeah.
Like
You
I know
don't
what
want
I'm
any
at
doubt.
breakfast.
Yeah. You don't want any doubt in your mind. And I think
No,
a lot of that comes down to like how busy you are and how worthwhile and what emotional investment you have in your food. Like, does
yeah,
it really cause much internal conflict with you if you eat the same food every day? Clearly not. For some people, that might be an issue. So for them, it's like, right, you can do these things, you can make some adjustments. But for you in your situation, it's like, right, my goals mean it doesn't make sense for me to have so much level of flexibility, adaptability, variety. Like I'd rather just kind of nail this shit daily, double check it via tracking,
yeah.
get on with my day. I've more important.
Literally that. Literally that. Like I have a huge reliance on, for example, you know, I had stomach issues.
Yes.
Yeah, like I was being sick and vomiting, etc., which basically turned out it was a hiatus hernia, but it's still ongoing and being investigated. So if you don't know what hiatus hernia is, it's basically where your stomach's gone through your diaphragm and it just creates another pouch, which is where food basically will additionally get stored, which will create sickness, which is less than ideal. Like, especially when you're in your peak off season trying to put on weight. And it's just like, I went through a period of like 3 months where my body weight just did not move when I was being sick daily, if not 2-3 times a day. It wasn't fun. I didn't enjoy it. Fortunately, it's kind of more under control now, but it's that digestion issue. And I think whatever food that you're eating, your ability to digest it and uptake nutrients is the most important thing. It doesn't make a difference if you're just slamming in thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of calories if you're not digesting it, if your appetite's shot to shit, if these are all considerations that you need to have as a coach when you've got a client in front of you. It's like, okay, how can we make that better? Like I have a huge reliance on fruit juice now, for example, like smoothies, because of the ability for me to digest that and get the calories in. If I drink in 750 ml of smoothie, that's 100 carb, done, easy. And that's not even something that I have to physically eat, because carbs have more volume. Like ultimately, you ask me to eat 100 carb of rice, that's vastly different than the 750 ml of smoothie, you know. Like as long as the consideration is of blood sugars being managed, that's all that matters really, you know. And as long as you're still digesting, as long as you can still go to the toilet, as long as everything else is there and all these other boxes are ticked, that's all that's really needs to be considered. And I think that's one of the things that with check-ins as well, like I ask clients, it's like, how many times have you been to the toilet? Do you have any digestive issues? Do you have any have you been sick this week, or you had any element of sickness? It's like all these elements of points of reference are there in order to kind of give biofeedback to us as coaches to make sure that, you know, if there's a trend over a period of time, we can look at it and be like, okay, well, let's look at your food. Let's look at this. Let's look at that. And then and bring that to the attention of an individual. Yeah.
That's the thing. It's like just nailing down the basics, and then once you get to that point, it's like right now we start to dig in deeper, optimize. We look at like where your food sits within the day relative to sleep and wake and training and proximity to facilitate digestion and all these other factors. But again, don't miss the forest by looking at the trees. You know what I mean? Like get the big picture, look at what's important, overall energy balance, overall kind of like social or psychological engagement or comfort with your nutritional setup. And yeah, don't overthink it. Like I think a lot of people who emphasize so much on their nutrition and talk so much about nutrition need to be focusing on their training.
Yeah. Well, to be fair though, it's like at the end of the day, training intensity is a huge effect.
There's only so much you can do with nutrition. You know what I mean? Like you
Yeah.
can nail your macros, but again, if you're not fucking training well or consistently or
Yeah.
with intensity, like fuck all is going to happen. You know,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
your nutrition is just kind of setting up that recovery basis, but you can have all the recovery, no stimulus, and nothing happens.
Yeah.
So that's the segue into next week's episode. We will discuss training. And yeah, same as always, guys, if you have any feedback, any questions, ping them through to us directly on Instagram. Show notes, comments, all that shit. Appreciate the listen. Take care. Much
Thanks,
love.
guys.